Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Supplemental 5, Christine de Pizan and the Body Politic. Today we're going to explore some of Christine de Pizan's writings in the lead up to the Civil War and in the midst of it. I feel like I should start this episode with a disclaimer that I am far from an expert on literary criticism and far from an expert on gender studies, and both fields will influence this episode. I've read a good amount of Christine de Pizan's writings, but a lot of the analysis will come from my secondary sources, which you can find on the podcast website, granddukesofthewest.com. However, I feel that it's still important for me to state my opinion of de Pizan's point of view with regards to the Civil War. I personally find the most likely explanation for Christine de Pizan's politics is that she was mostly neutral in the lead up to the Civil War. I think she probably leaned Orleanist at the end of the day, but she happily took commissions from the Dukes of Burgundy and was not afraid of praising them. However, this shifts after the assassination of the Duke of Orleans, and in the years after 1407 she continually leans more Armagnac. But as Louis of Guienne worked to build his own royalist party, she shifted her support there. Her writings are quite limited after the death of Louis of Guienne, but I think it's pretty fair to assume that she became a Dauphinist once Charles took charge. This is a fairly standard summary of Christine de Pizan's political allegiance over the years, but it is not the only one. Some tellings present her as a Burgundian throughout Philip the Bold's life, and some even maintain that position into John the Fearless's first few years as Duke of Burgundy, with de Pizan not supporting the Armagnac cause until the Civil War had already begun. There's also been a more recent trend of seeing de Pizan as a staunch Orleanist throughout her life, which in my opinion is best conveyed in Tracy Adams' book, Christine de Pizan and the Fight for France. Adams very convincingly looks through Christine de Pizan's writings throughout her life to point out support for Orleans and opposition to Burgundy. While Adams does important work in pushing back against Burgundian propaganda, which has come down to us through the ages, I personally think that she goes a bit too far in the Orleanist direction. That being said, Adams' work on de Pizan is excellent, and will make up a good portion of this episode. A lot of this is open for interpretation, and at the end of the day, Christine de Pizan's personal feelings are somewhat unknowable. They can only be argued more or less convincingly. For example, take a passage from the Vision of Christine de Pizan, which she wrote in 1405. In this passage, de Pizan describes two butterflies coming from Charles V's entrails, which then turn into falcons. The butterflies turned birds are generally considered to be Charles VI and Louis of Orleans, but another reading of the passage can reinterpret them as the rival popes of the Western Schism. Christine de Pizan often works in allegory and metaphor, where multiple interpretations of her texts are possible, and more often than not, intended. All of this is to say that if you disagree with anything that I present here, your thoughts on the subject are just as valid as mine, and we shouldn't presume to truly know de Pizan's thoughts on everything. Most of what we know about her comes from her writings, and we should keep in mind that those writings were always meant for an audience, which could range from the Dukes of Burgundy to Orleans to the Queen to the Dauphin, to unspecified princes of the future, to royal officers, and more. And furthermore, I'll be focusing on Christine de Pizan's political philosophy above her poetry or her writings on gender. Now, all of these subjects are intertwined, as her poetry often conveyed political commentary in its subtext, and her political works didn't ignore the status of women in society. But I do want to keep this episode relatively compact. I'll bring up a few of her different writings, but I will be focusing on three: the Book of the Body Politic, the Lament on the Evils of Civil War, and the Book of Peace. I know that this disclaimer has been going on for a while, and if you do want to learn more about Christine de Pizan, many of her works are available online, and many more are easily found in books. For secondary literature, I'll recommend Christine de Pizan and the Fight for France by Tracy Adams, Politics, Gender, and Genre, The Political Thought of Christine de Pizan, edited by Margaret Brabant, and Healing the Body Politic, The Political Thought of Christine de Pizan, edited by Karen Green and Constant Muse. Now, let's begin the meat of this episode with a bit of biography. Christine de Pizan was born in Venice around 1364 and moved to Paris as a child when her father became a member of King Charles V's court as an astrologer. When she was 15, Christine married a royal secretary, and the couple would have 3 children together. She likely expected a comfortable life as a member of court society, but her fortunes changed about a decade later when 2 unexpected deaths hit her family. Christine's father died in 1388, and her husband died in 1390. All of a sudden, Christine de Pizan was responsible for herself, her mother, her children, and a niece. She first tried to collect some money which the court owed her late husband, and then tried to take control of some property which had reverted to the crown when her husband died. Unfortunately for de Pizan, both avenues came up null. She managed to sell some property which she had inherited from her father to make ends meet for a time, and from there her fortunes began to improve when she leveraged her connections at court to gain commissions to write love poetry for the princes and princesses of France. Christine de Pizan was lucky to have received a good education as a child, and in her Book of the Mutability of Fortune, she writes that she received 2 precious stones from her father, representing his intelligence and knowledge. Her writing spoke for itself, and from 1393 onwards, she became a highly sought-after court writer, and soon expanded from love poetry to political, historical, and philosophical tracts. Christine de Pizan accepted commissions from, and dedicated her works to, many of the great French lords and ladies of her time, such as the King and Queen, the Dauphin, John of Berry, Louis of Orleans, Philip the Bold, and John the Fearless. De Pizan, despite being an Italian by birth, became a true French patriot, and for much of her life she was deeply invested in the cause of France. As the situation in France worsened, de Pizan began to identify her widowhood and the struggles that came with it with the ravages of the Civil War. So as the conflict between the houses of Orleans and Burgundy began to heat up, Christine's writings tried to call on Philip and Louis, and then John and Louis, to set aside their rivalry and focus their ambitions on supporting the crown. She also called on the Queen to mediate the dispute between the princes. In her letter to the Queen of France, written in 1405 during the standoff after the kidnapping of the Dauphin, Christine wrote, quote, "Willingly hear the complaint and pitiful regrets of the suffering and suppliant French people, now full of affliction and sadness, and who cry with tearful voices to you, their supreme and revered lady, praying by the mercy of God, that a humble pity may show your tender heart their desolation and misery, so that you can proceed and obtain peace soon between these 2 princes of the same blood." While on the surface, this letter may appear to chastise the Queen for failing to resolve the situation, Tracy Adams points out that Isabeau was actually already working to mediate the dispute between Burgundy and Orleans. Therefore, this open letter can be seen as an attempt to support that position of mediation. We've seen throughout the show that the office of Queen had the potential to grant significant power, but a lot of that power was indirect and easily challenged. By openly calling on the Queen to resolve the dispute between Louis and John, Christine hopes to give support to the Queen and justify her intervention, rather than criticize her. Around the time of this conflict, Christine was also likely working on the Book of the Body Politic, which was probably finished around 1406. In a time where the political order of the day appeared to be breaking down, de Pizan expressed what was in her mind the ideal form of that order, using the human body as a metaphor. Christine de Pizan wasn't the first to use this metaphor, and we have reason to believe that she was inspired by the earlier thinker, John of Salisbury. But she does put her own spin on it. The king is the head of the body, the nobles are the hands and arms, and the common people are the belly, legs, and feet. De Pizan's Body Politic stresses the responsibilities that each group has to each other, but also stresses the hierarchy inherent in her vision of the world. Salisbury's Body Politic focused more on the need for each part of the body to work together, and even contains a discussion on tyrannicide when the ruler abused their power. Notably, Salisbury doesn't necessarily advocate for tyrannicide, but does write that tyrants will suffer and considers the act of tyrannicide as somewhere between neutral and positive. This can be contrasted with how de Pizan wrote about the relationship between the estates. As Kate Langdon Foran writes, quote, "Her focus as a political writer must stress not only interdependence, but also obligation, both individual and collective. The crisis of her time is not a tyrannical ruler, but a weak one. Thus, her politics must be more than a politics of inclusion. It must be a politics of responsibility, representation, and political obligation." While the Book of the Body Politic is full of warnings against abuse of power and station, Christine de Pizan never advocates for any group to rise up against the one above it in the social hierarchy. For her, the primary danger of these abuses was the threat that they posed to the proper order of things, rather than oppression of those below. Christine de Pizan filled the Book of the Body Politic with advice for the various estates and descriptions of an orderly society. The book was divided into 3 sections, for the princes, the nobles and knights, and the common people. It was also dedicated to the young Dauphin, Louis of Guyenne, and so Part 1 also includes a fair bit of information dedicated to the proper way to raise a prince. A prince should be raised on simple food and have a schedule that balances play, prayer, and learning. Christine, who obviously valued a good education, outlines an academic routine which includes reading, writing, Latin, logic, philosophy, and theology. As the prince ages, other skills must also be taught, such as leadership, combat, war tactics, and strategy, as well as self-discipline. It is important for a prince to be taught by men of good character, and the prince should be surrounded by disciplined knights and wise counselors. This should rear a wise ruler who follows the 3 principles of good rule: love of God, love of the people and the kingdom, and love of justice. Christine de Pizan's ideal king was Louis of Guyenne's grandfather, Charles V, and in this book, and others on ruling, de Pizan draws on Charles's example, both explicitly and implicitly. She writes of his perfection of virtue, and calls him illustrious, knowledgeable, wise, and prudent. One of the things that Christine takes care to praise Charles V for was his use of advisors and counselors. This makes sense based on her personal history, considering both her husband and father were royal counselors and had ties to the marmosets, but it also falls in line with Christine's own political philosophy. Christine de Pizan writes, quote, "If the prince has wise counselors, he can maintain the rule of justice and other particular laws, and increase and multiply the virtue, strength, power, and wealth of his country." She argues that counselors should be older, wise men, whose passions have been tempered by age, and who carried vast experience. We can thus see that de Pizan encouraged a conciliar and official-based royal government around a strong ruler, a kind of proto-absolutism, as some scholars have put it, rather than the more traditional, aristocratic, or feudal form based on the consensus of the nobility. Christine goes on at length about the virtues that a prince should have and the ways that he should rule. After that, she moves on to the roles and duties of the knights and nobles. Like with the first section, she begins by discussing the proper way to raise young knights. She then goes on to list the 6 attributes that nobles and knights should strive for: that they ought to maintain a knowledge and love of arms, that they be bold, that they maintain an esprit de corps with other knights, that they uphold their fealty and keep their word, that they desire honor and glory above all worldly things, and that they be cunning against their enemies. As the nobles and knights of the realm are the hands and arms of the body politic, they should push away the bad things and bring in good, and the relation between the arms and hands to the role of combat is self-evident. Throughout the Book of the Body Politic, de Pizan draws on examples from ancient and classical history, and the wisdom of both the ancient philosophers and church fathers. As Kate Langdon Foran writes, de Pizan made sure to include plenty of, quote, stories from Roman experience, with considerable emphasis placed on the importance of truth and honoring one's word, a somewhat pointed lesson in a time of civil war. This was emphasized by Christine de Pizan herself, as when discussing negative examples of rulership, she wrote, quote, One could speak of these cruel princes of times past, and even in present times there would be enough to find. But because this could not be turned to good example, I will pass over them lightly. Is she speaking of John the Fearless or Louis of Orleans here? It's hard to say, but there's definitely some inferring that can be done. Christine de Pizan then moves on to section 3 on the common people, who are the belly, legs, and feet of the body politic. She writes, quote, "For just as the human body is not whole, but defective and deformed when it lacks any of these members, so the body politic cannot be perfect, whole, nor healthy, if all the estates which we speak are not well joined and united together." Despite their lack of political power, for de Pizan, the common people were still a key part of the body politic. In John of Salisbury's Body Politic, the section devoted to the commons was focused on their role as peasants. But by de Pizan's time, they were not simply the people of the land. Of course, peasants still made up the large majority of the commons and of the entire population for that matter. But in the centuries between the lives of these two thinkers, the importance of the cities and of the bourgeoisie had increased significantly. De Pizan divided the commons into 4 groups: the clergy, the bourgeois, the artisans, and the peasants. In discussing the clergy, Christine mostly discusses students of theology, and spends most of her time praising their pursuit of knowledge. She then moves on to discussing the bourgeois and the merchants. For Christine de Pizan, these members of the middle class were not only important economic drivers, they also played a key role in mediating between the classes. As I said earlier, de Pizan was a firm believer in hierarchy, and while she considered the artisans and peasants to be important members of society, she also doesn't believe that they have a right to revolt or even to petition the lords for change. Therefore, the middle class should bring the worries of the lower classes to the attention of the princes, so that they would not be driven to revolt by desperation. She writes, quote, "For humble people do not commonly have great prudence in words, or even in deeds that concern politics, and so they should not meddle in the ordinances established by princes. Burghers and the wealthy must take care that the common people are not hurt, so that they have no reason to conspire against the prince or his council. The reason is that these conspiracies and plots by the common people always come back to hurt those that have something to lose." Despite her dismissive attitude of the workers and peasants, Christine de Pizan still advocated for their fair treatment. Quote, "It is a sin to be ungrateful for the many services that they give us," she wrote. De Pizan encourages all the other members of the hierarchy to treat those at the bottom with respect, fairness, and dignity. This strictly hierarchical view of society has led some modern writers to label Christine de Pizan as a reactionary. However, I disagree. Christine de Pizan was never a radical thinker, but she was also not a reactionary. She had some progressive ideas and some regressive, but she stood firmly in the political center of her day. De Pizan never questioned the hierarchies of society, both based on class and gender, but she did advocate for more cooperation and fair treatment across the class and gender divide. It was bad to mistreat those below you, but it was just as bad, if not worse, to rise up against those above. Linda Lepig summarizes Christine's ideas of hierarchy and responsibility in the Body Politic succinctly, quote, "Whereas all the states are accountable to the prince as the highest authority within the body politic, the prince himself is accountable to God and to his people." In the years after Christine wrote the Book of the Body Politic, the situation in France really went downhill. The stresses in France had been noticeable when she was writing the book, but since then, John the Fearless had assassinated Louis of Orleans, and the League of Jean had formed in opposition to him. So as open civil war loomed on the horizon, Christine de Pizan wrote the Lament on the Evils of Civil War, an open letter to basically everyone in France with specific sections dedicated to the Queen and the Duke of Berry. She opens the letter despondently, quote, "Alone, and suppressing with great difficulty the tears which blur my sight and pour down my face like a fountain." De Pizan had watched in horror as the opposing factions took up arms, and in the 11th hour she called on everyone she could to halt the slide to civil war. To the knights she writes, quote, "O you, knight, who comes from such a battle, tell me, I pray you, what honor did you win there?" To the royal officers engaged in partisan bickering she writes, quote, "What use are you, if not for the royal council?" And to the clergy, quote, "O clerics of France, will you let fortune work its influence? Why do you not walk in processions and pray devoutly?" These members of the body politic had ignored their duties to ensure peace and stability in the kingdom. But the real cause of the crisis were the grandees. As we've seen in the book of the Body Politic, Christine de Pizan was a firm believer in the social hierarchy, and so wanted to, and needed to, be careful with how she criticized her social betters. But that doesn't mean that she didn't have any criticisms. She focused her writings to the princes on exhorting them to keep the peace and forgive each other, especially as they were all really one family. Quote, "What wrong have those men done to you? They, who like God, love you, and who are reputed to honor you in every land. It seems you want to treat them, not as sons, but as mortal enemies." In writing to the princes, Christine has to justify her place to give criticism. She opens the lament with the word solette, or alone. But solette was also a persona. She had used it as a nom de plume before, and it tended to be connected to her status as a widow. So in the lament, she presents herself as a figure that needs pity and compassion. And this appeal for pity is how much of the letter is justified. And speaking of her status as a widow, let's look at how Christine calls on the women of France. Like she does with the lament as a whole, in this section, she calls on the women of France to appeal to the pity of the warring nobles, and she does so in one of, in my opinion, the most moving lines that she's written. Quote, "So cry, cry, beat your hands and cry, as once the sad Argia did in such a case. You, ladies, damsels, and women of the kingdom of France, for the swords are sharpened which will make you widowed and destitute of children and parents." In a time where the actual political power of women was so limited, their role as influences on their husbands and sons could still be used. One notable woman with power was the queen. Christine de Pizan had called on the queen to intervene in the brewing conflict after the kidnapping of the Dauphin, and in the lament she calls on the queen once again. This time, the call is more direct and forceful, quote, "O, crowned Queen of France, are you still sleeping? Who prevents you from restraining now this side of your kin, and putting an end to this deadly enterprise? Do you not see the heritage of your noble children at stake? You, the mother of the noble heirs of France, revered princess, who but you can do anything, and who will disobey your sovereignty and authority if you rightly want to mediate a peace?" Well, many throughout history have seen this as a sharp criticism of Isabeau's inaction. Tracy Adams once again argues that de Pizan was affirming the queen's ability to moderate, and points out that she was not sleeping, but instead was actively attempting to moderate between the factions. As a woman, and as the mother of the heirs of France, while the queen's explicit power was limited, her role as a mediator had its roots in the position of the queen generally, and the ordinances of the early 1400s more specifically. The line, "Who will disobey your sovereignty and authority?" works as an attempt to discredit any who would do such a thing. Christine de Pizan finishes her lament by calling on the Duke of Berry, one of the leaders of the League of Jean, to lay down his arms. When Christine wrote the lament in August of 1410, the Duke of Berry was in Tours with the League while they gathered their forces. She called on John of Berry to come to Paris and help the queen mediate a settlement between Burgundy and Orleans. Quote, "So come, noble Duke of Berry, prince of high excellence, and follow the divine law which orders peace. Take a strong hold of the bridle, and stop this dishonorable army, at least until you have talked to the parties. Will you come to Paris, to the city of your father, where you were born, which cries out to you, wailing with sighs and tears, and asks and demands of you, come quickly to comfort the adored city, and advance with the tongue of correction towards your children. If you see them erring, then pacify them like a good father. While the Duke of Berry had aligned himself with the League of Gieux, he wasn't a hardcore member of the League. He had joined it in order to recover his influence in France, and if he managed to negotiate a settlement, he might have regained some of that influence. So the call to negotiate had its merits. Christine even intimates that to the Duke, quote, "And if you work constantly to that purpose, you will be called Father of this kingdom, Keeper of the crown and of the very noble fleur-de-lis, Guardian of the high lineage, Protector of noble men against death, Comfort of the people, Guardian of the noble ladies, widows, and orphans." He could regain his power and enhance his prestige by making peace. De Pizan calls the cause of the League dishonorable, but this shouldn't be seen as an endorsement of the Burgundian cause. Above all, Christine de Pizan wanted both sides in the brewing civil war to lay down their arms and reach a settlement. But as we know, and unfortunately for France, it was not to be. However, in 1412, with the signing of the Peace of Auxerre, things began to look up, and Christine de Pizan began writing the Book of Peace. The Book of Peace, like the Book of the Body Politic, was dedicated to Louis of Guyenne, and the content of the two books tends to overlap significantly. So in my discussion of the Book of Peace, I'm mostly going to look at how Christine reacted to the past few years of civil war, and how that went into the book. Angus Kennedy contrasts the Book of the Body Politic and the Book of Peace by calling the first a book full of promises, and the second a book of failure. This can be seen clearly in the preface to the book. As I said above, she began the Book of Peace after the Peace of Auxerre. However, when that peace deal didn't hold, she gave up writing it, only to continue it after the Peace of Pontoise and the fall of the Cabotians. Therefore, the Book of Peace has a more somber tone. There is still some optimism in it, but the scars of the Civil War are evident. So while many of the same topics get brought up, such as the necessity of good advisors, the dangers of evil ones, the merits of Charles V, and the dangers of popular uprising, all of these come with much more baggage. The first major difference between the two books comes from the fact that when the Book of the Body Politic was written, Louis of Guyenne was a child, while the Louis of Guyenne for whom the Book of Peace was written was a teenager with some political experience. In 1412, he was beginning to move away from the Duke of Burgundy, and was beginning to form his own political bloc. Christine admires this, and uses the example of Charles V to encourage Louis to be prudent and to continue working to expand his power. She writes, quote, "This king was kind above all the princes of the world, and with a joyful demeanor among all people, so that he never spoke or acted harshly against anyone. But still, his prudent manner and beautiful eloquence caused him to be regarded with such great respect that no one, no matter how grand, dared cross him in anything, not even his brothers." That last bit is especially poignant in the wake of a civil war caused by overmighty magnates. If Louis of Guyenne can recreate these virtues of his grandfather, he can restore order and the royal dignity. Christine de Pizan spends the rest of the first part of the Book of Peace talking about the need to use wise advisors to help rule, and how to tell good advisors from bad ones. But then the Peace of Auxerre failed. The Cabotian uprising wasn't even what caused Christine de Pizan to stop writing, as the peace was already seen as a failure before the first sparks of rebellion broke out. So Christine de Pizan stopped writing. But after the Peace of Pontoise, she took up her quill once more. Early in the second part of the Book of Peace, Christine writes, quote, "Once again, taking up again what was said above, most noble and excellent prince, I say to you that after my initial joy at the peace made last year between those of your blood, I abandoned the happy song I had sung right to the end of the first part of this volume. Because peace, the very theme and title of this book, eluded me on account of ill-informed people and the demagogues and base rabble by whose plots and conspiracies the good of peace has since been disturbed." Her thoughts on the Cabotian rebels and on John the Fearless's alliance with them were obviously not hidden. And this makes sense given her previous statements on rebellion and the role of workers in politics, or lack thereof, from the Book of the Body Politic. She returns to the metaphor of the body politic in the third part of the Book of Peace, in the context of civil war. Quote, "Reflect on how frightful it would be to see a man so charged with anger that he strove to destroy himself by tearing his own flesh with his teeth, his hands hitting each other with great blows, and each pulling against the other, the feet striking his eyes if that were possible, and withal the whole body thrashing in furious movement against itself. One would certainly say that such a man was moved by great madness. But alas, is it not similar with civil war in a country, and especially in this one? For in no place were the nobles ever so like one single body as here and now, as they should be." Despite all the bitterness that is evident in parts of the Book of Peace, Christine de Pizan focuses on the future in the book and hasn't given up hope. But unfortunately for her, and for France, the peace secured at Pontoise wasn't destined to last long either, and things continued to go from bad to worse for the kingdom. Her writings over the next few years are quite limited, and for a while she retired to a nunnery, despondent at the ongoing civil war and English invasion. However, in the last years of her life, things began to turn around for France. One of de Pizan's last works was the Song of Joan of Arc. While Christine de Pizan never saw the English driven out of France, or the end of the conflict between the Burgundians and Dauphinists, she was able to look optimistically to the future once more before she died. Thank you so much to my patrons. Once again, I'm happy to announce that we have 2 new patrons to thank: Peter, Duc de Brancion, and Tyler, Comte de Chamaret. And also to Christine, Duchesse de Nemours, Elliot, Graf von Kravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, James, Graf von Tensa, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Meursault, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Semur, David, Graf von Bornum, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Quintin, Graf von Blasfeld, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.